All right, we're a minute in, so we'll officially get started. Thanks for coming today to our webinar. So we are talking all about customizing generative AI. So as you can see from the title, thinking a lot about chat, but Gen AI has a lot of different potentials and purposes and use cases, and so do other forms of AI. And so we'll talk about what we see as a difference and go through some examples of ways we're seeing it being used. Hopefully you'll learn a bit about the potential for this technology in your organization or use cases or experiments that you're running yourselves. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the lands I'm joining from today. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community, and pay our respect to their elders, past and present. For me, I'm joining on Wurundjeri lands. I'm in Marybeck, also known as Brunswick, in the inner north suburbs of Melbourne. We acknowledge our guests. We are guests living and working on this land that's been cared for tens of thousands of years by Indigenous people. You should see our panelists now in the chat and on your screen. So we have today joining us Inkanksha Malik. She's a founder of Paths Uncovered, a really excellent podcast as well that you can check out on our website. Also a data and AI consultant. We have Dean, who's a project officer at National Justice Project, and he'll be sharing some insights of working on a project where we are just now launching in the generative AI space that's going to improve access to justice. And we have Chris. He's the CEO and founder of UserDoc, a platform that he'll be talking through as well that leverages AI to help organizations and technical people build cool things. And Chris has got a long experience here at Portable as well. And yeah, so just about Portable. So you probably may know this already if you have our newsletter or generally have been across the website, but we're a human-centered design, digital design and development agency based across Australia. We've been at this for over a decade now, and working in different impact areas with the mission of seeking out areas of social need and policy failure to make transformational change using research, design, and technology. So utilizing tech is one of our skill sets among many, and these are the kind of sectors we love to make change in when possible. So justice, we'll be talking through a case study today with the National Justice Project. We work in the public sector, not-for-profits. We work in mental health, which also has huge potential and a lot of risks and other considerations to think about when using things like generative AI and transport and education. So first of all, just to break up me rattling on a bit, we've been using this word generative AI and Gen AI a lot. So people may also know it by the model names, things like large language models. But I guess just at its most basic and in simplest one or two sentences, what do you all understand by Gen AI? So what do you mean when you use terms like Gen AI? I might start with Chris, if you can just give a little basic definition of what he thinks Gen AI is.
Yeah, certainly. Generative AI, really the ability to be able to generate multimodal output, so meaning like text or imagery or documents and things like this, using AI, where artificial intelligence was sort of traditionally used for, classifying data and this sort of thing. It's really like these large language models can give us far more sort of, human level output, I would say.
Excellent. Now, Dean, I think we've been on the journey for about the same amount of time of learning about what Gen AI is and how to. You're like me, you're a bit less on the developer and technical side, and so we've both been learning a lot through this process. And I guess, what are your key takeaways for Gen AI and what it's capable of?
Yeah, I think originally before we had started on this project, I thought it was some weird beast that had a lot of hidden secrets that no one knew of. But the more that we worked on it, I realized that it's kind of a big guessing game, and it's a probability game of what's going to be next in the sentence, and it kind of studies, or it's a study of humans and how we speak and interact. And I think it's pretty cool in that aspect because it's almost a reflection of us.
Excellent, thanks. And in Kaksha, he mentioned data predictions, that sort of thing, statistics. So I guess from a data perspective, and also having worked in the more traditional forms of AI, what do you see different about Gen AI now and what it's doing and what it's capable of?
Yeah, like I think it was interesting when it kind of came out and was like, oh, here's another it's another version of AI and there's another term that we're gonna get buzzed up about. But I mean, at the end of the day, you can kind of think of it as a technology that doesn't just analyze the information, but can actually produce something new. And that's kind of the main aspect of Gen AI, where there's actually creation of something, whether that's text or images or whatever music, for all we know. Like it doesn't really matter, but it's just something new being created on the other end of it.
Right.
So yeah, it's kind of more. about the fact that we're now actually using AI to create rather than just to predict, which would have been kind of that more traditional usage of AI back along the ways.
Yeah,
But
totally.
it's not
That
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 long.
creation element, thinking about the use cases as well, is going to be really important because our work with Dean has been really trying to get at how to make things accurate. That's the most important part of customizing when we were looking at in the legal space. But generative AI does have a lot of creative applications as well. So you mentioned images. There's entire movies now that are capable of being made through some of the new advances with things like Sora. But what we're looking at today is customizing Gen AI, thinking about what applications is it useful for, and what kind of tweaks do we make to the model? How do we consider different infrastructure needs? So the more technical things can be just you can read our report, which I'll link to at the end for a bit more of a technical overview. But some of these questions here are really about thinking what do we need to be able to do to build custom architecture interfaces and set up the necessary guardrails to build new products and services with these existing models that better suit our audience and use cases. So, um, like you would have seen, ChatGPT would have changed the landscape, late 2022. And ever since then, we've been really interested in what are the ways that we can customize beyond the interfaces they're giving us and use it in different kinds of products and use cases. So yeah, that's just what we're thinking about here. We're not talking about building new models. That's a whole endeavor that requires massive amounts of data and expertise, but just really making the best use of what currently is out there. So in that vein, today we're going to be looking at what is a useful case study. So thinking about new digital products with the Hear Me Out innovation for increasing access to justice that just launched from the National Justice Project. We're looking at adapting generative AI to different use cases or organizations. So what are the things you want to be thinking about? When is AI actually a good choice? When are there other models or technology that you should be considering? And what's the playbook for experimenting with Gen AI safely and efficiently? So what have we learned in our experiments at Portable? And what do our panelists also have to say about best practice for experimenting with Gen AI? So starting off with our first topic, so looking at what is it like to deliver an AI project? How is it different from other digital projects? So um, we're going to start with just a little introduction into our partners here at the National Justice Project. So I'll hand over to you, Dean.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So we are the National Justice Project. We are a small not-for-profit legal organization, and we really our slogan is to fearlessly fight to end discrimination in all Australia. So we started around 10 years ago as a really small five person team, and since then we've taken on cases against government, against policing, in the areas of First Nations rights, custodial justice, youth detention, and a whole lot, refugee law. So as the 10 years have gone on, we've kind of shifted into projects and building out projects. So we have a few. We have one called Call It Out, which is Australia's first and only First Nations racism register. We have another one, which is a campaign for first responders. And then now we have Hear Me Out, which is an AI platform, which we'll get to. Um, but yeah, we really want to challenge systemic discrimination, and we do it through our platforms and partnerships. And now with this whole new world of AI and tech, it's kind of opened up a whole bunch of doors, and we've had partnerships with groups such as Portable that we've never been able to have before, and it's been an amazing experience. And yeah, I look forward to speaking about it more.
Excellent. So you mentioned a couple of projects we're looking at Hear Me Out today, which don't remember exactly when we started writing the grant, but it was something that we had an idea for, or you guys had an idea for, and we were both in discussion about it before finding a grant to fund the initial project. So we were looking at the first version, a pilot and MVP, which is probably another thing to consider, a minimal viable product when you're thinking about AI, defining the use case and keeping it small. So for the first iteration, we're looking at just New South Wales and federal complaints, but there's a bit of text there, but can you just give us an overview of what the vision of Hear Me Out is?
Yeah, so Hear Me Out started originally because we are a not-for-profit and kind of strapped for resources. We would have a lot of people calling us who we unfortunately just couldn't help. And we would off-ramp them to maybe other organizations or complaints bodies. But really what would have helped was a piece of technology that could just tell you where to go if you fall but somewhere between having something horrible happen to you and not having to go to a lawyer to get justice. Yeah, there was just a gap wherein people didn't know who to go to and how to get their justice. Within that is the complaint system, which is a beast. In New South Wales alone, there's around 70 complaint bodies, and then in Australia, there's over 240 complaint bodies. And a lot of the complaint bodies have overlapping jurisdictions where if you have an employment complaint, it'll the complaint body that you should go to will change depending on whether you work for a public or a private organization or what exactly happened, if it was discrimination or if it was a privacy concern, or there's just a lot of different factors to determine which body is right and playing. And it's just overly confusing to know where exactly to go. So that's how we kind of came to this idea of, the one-stop shop to figure out where to go and how to make a complaint. And yeah, we spent the last year working with Portable to figure out how exactly it should be received by users and the best course of action to bring all of the resources together and provide the user with the best option for accessing the justice that they deserve.
Yep. You know, because I was on the project, I know it wasn't a straightforward path. Well, it was pretty straightforward, but it wasn't an assumption up front that Gen AI is the best use case here because especially at its early stages, the cost could have been fairly prohibitive depending on how we set it up. So we're thinking about with each query that comes associated with your token costs, and these tokens can, I think at the time it was 1,000 times more expensive than it is now. So are there other ways that we can solve this problem? There's decision trees. If we were to organize people's responses into yes, no questions, could we get to the right pathway? But like you mentioned, there's so much nuance between different pathways, plus so many different pathways to choose from. I think there's 74 currently that we are suggesting just with New South Wales and federal, not including the other states that we want to move into. So the size of that was a bit too hard to wrangle. And so over time, we did go through a process of design research where we tested different prototypes and interfaces of chats, boxes, and buttons and things that people who actually have had complaints would test with us to determine how useful this is. And that gave us an indication of the potential of generative AI to solve to provide people with information using their kind of plain language. What other kind of considerations did you remember from those early stages when we were deciding if Gen AI is a right fit or not?
Yeah, well, I remember beginning it was something like 4 or 5 pillars. So one was accessibility. We needed whatever was provided to be as accessible as possible. And when we were considering the decision tree, that was one of the reasons that we thought it wouldn't work was because of the nuances between each body. By the time you start a complaint and then move through a survey of questions, it would take with some of those bodies at least an hour just to get from start to finish. So accessibility was up there, data privacy and security, yeah, key consideration. And then because it is a kind of at-risk area with the data that's put into hear me out. So, if someone says a name of someone and there's a data concern there and it opens up legal risk. So we needed a system that we felt was secure enough to output options that weren't legal advice, but just were really well-informed pieces of knowledge and information.
Mhm.
Yeah. And the other part was the empowerment piece. With something like a survey, you don't get that empowerment or education. Whereas the AI can tell you where to go, how to make a complaint, and it uses the knowledge from the fact sheets that we created to really give you a full understanding of why that's the right place for you.
Yeah. And so that was the process of deciding if you're thinking back to that simple graphic I had earlier with 3 layers of infrastructure, model, and the application, that itself was up for grabs. So that was thinking about which model do we want to choose between. And so once we decided that layered approach with us developing a custom interface, so it's a website that has all the information. If you wanted to go through traditional ways of searching through a website, keywords or filters to find a page that looks like something that may be useful to you and skimming and scanning, that's a way that users can get that information, or they can go into the chat. And so building that chat required us to look at the infrastructure, think about what are the data and privacy considerations of the cost, this, ongoing subscription plus per token, looking at the model and evaluating um, the performance of different models that had different levels of accuracy through our testing, and then building that application layer. So based on those steps, I think it was really innovative about our way of working in our project was, and about working with your organization, was the wealth of data, of legal information that you had. So can you talk us through what fact sheets are? So what we're looking at now is scenarios that are tagged as complex or simple when we're sourcing this data set. And you drafted these user scenarios based off of your experience of how people come to you and ask these questions, and then where you would send them to. And then with each of these, we also provided a link to the fact sheet or the source data that we would want to pull from to give users the content they need to understand where to go. So talk us through what fact sheets were for the organization and how they're used.
Yeah, so the first thing that we had to do was bring all of the resources and information of the complaint bodies into one format that was uniform between each. If you look at two different bodies, the information might be outdated, or what's online might not be reflective of what they can actually handle. So we just wanted to make the information of the complaint bodies as clear as possible for anyone reading them. So we created one fact sheet for every complaint body, which ran through every step of the complaint process, from the complaint types you can make to whether you're eligible to make the complaint, all the way down to how to make the complaint and where to make the complaint. So with those, they had a twofold purpose. One is to be available to anyone who wants to find out the information on the complaints body, but the other one was to feed the knowledge for the AI on the back end through the retrieval augmented generation. So they had to be quite detailed so that any small nuances or differences between each body could be picked up. And the AI did really well in picking those differences up. So once we had a fact sheet for everybody and we implemented that to the back end of the AI, the way that we tested them was by creating these scenarios. And I should mention also, we were very fortunate in that we had a team of partners and stakeholders who work on the front line in legal centers, community legal centers, who helped us create these. So these scenarios in particular, it was really critical because these are all scenarios that they had, that were common to them. They weren't specific to any person that had come, but they were common to them. So we knew that they were reflective of what may actually be input into the AI. So we came up with, I think it was over 200 of these scenarios: simple, moderate, complex. The simple ones were one issue, one complaints body. The moderate were one issue, and by issue I mean one sector. So it could be discrimination, for example, but multiple complaint bodies. And then the complex were multiple issues, multiple complaint bodies, so that we knew we had as robust of a testing criteria as possible. So we created these 200, and we kind of went through an iterative testing process. Am I jumping the gun here? Sorry.
No, no, that's good.
An iterative testing process where we would chuck them all in originally, see what the results were like, and we'd go through one by one and test whether it was a pass or a fail, or why it was a pass or a fail. And then we would kind of make the amendments to reflect where the gaps were showing, and then we'd test again. And we kept doing that over, what was it, like 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And we had originally hoped for, we would have been happy with an 80% success rate, but we ended up landing on around 90%, which was unreal. So yeah, that was kind of the testing process, and that's how the scenarios were used.
Yeah, and it's very fortunate. So I remember early on writing a couple of them, a couple scenarios, and having to include where to go. And after doing that a couple of times, realizing I have to make this a full-time job to create this data set, and I don't want to do that. So it's very happy to have the network of partners, because synthetic data sets that could be more automated of the process are really useful in some use cases, but in here it was really important for us to have that accuracy and oversight from people who actually work in the legal sector. What we're looking at now is one of the dashboards that our developer developed to be able to run these tests and make these tweaks. There's different ways of doing this. On another project, we're looking at sharing directly with the subject matter experts and having them able to switch the models and regenerate the scenario and note any differences that they think are better or worse. In this case, it was more about the scenario itself, being able to provide a summary or examples of the outputs. And just because we had the model identified, it was more around, like you said, the retrieval augmented generation process, which is a very useful and important way to make the model suit your needs. And so if you want to learn more about RAG, that's one area that I think I've upskilled the most in terms of my little tech words that I can throw around for AI now, which is the RAG process and these experiments. And yeah, so tell us about the results. What are we looking at now, and what's the future of Hear Me Out?
Yeah, so we after we had kind of or Portable had done the user interface and kind of connected the AI to that, we had the platform ready to go. We have shared it with a network of people because at the moment it is live and available for the public, but because it is legal in the legal sector, we want to make sure that the although we have done extensive testing, we do want to make sure that the AI still is performing as well as possible before it goes into the big wide world. So for the moment, we have a group of trusted, government officials and legal partners all working using the AI. And we are planning to extend that to the general public and have a push over the next couple of months. And 2025, we will start to expand, hopefully, to Victoria. And then over the next couple of years, cover the whole of Australia so that all Australians have an improved form of improved access to justice or pathway to justice. And in that as well, they have a trust in the process because, yeah, there's multifaceted benefits. That we learn in our usability testing sessions that, it just has, it's bringing kind of the power to the people, and really bringing that empowerment piece, which we're very happy with.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And our portable training and events account has put the link in the chat if anyone's keen on playing around with it. Looking forward to scaling and improving. So thanks for running through that case study, Dean. Now we have our other two panelists are going to join the conversation and talk a bit more about what do we need to know about different forms of AI to adapt it to our use cases and organizations. So I'll start with you, Chris. So you've got a lot of experience building all kinds of technology. Most recently, you've embarked on this user doc journey, which is something we actually use at Portable, and it's a really interesting platform. So can you talk us through your experience of designing this AI platform? So where did it start? How did you decide where AI or generative AI in particular fits into the digital product that you built?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess a bit of background, UserDoc, the problems that we're solving is around the software requirements space. So the leading cause of software failure or like software projects going over time or over budget is around the requirements phase. So that's clearly defining what needs to be done, making sure it aligns with end user goals, making sure it's complete, there's no bits missing, it's not ambiguous, etc. In my previous incarnation of my career, I was a software developer and ran a software consultancy. So I was entrenched in this problem. In my younger years, I thought that the code was the way out of this, building, engineering more and being better at this sort of thing would make it better. Where it took me a few years to realize it's actually more obviously about defining upfront the clear metrics of what needs to happen for a system, right? So that's the bit of a background of what UserDoc tries to solve. So essentially, it's a platform that helps businesses build out their user stories. If you're familiar with the agile concepts of defining requirements, so user stories, user personas, user journeys, acceptance criteria. These make sure that the often technical concepts of what needs to be developed or delivered is sort of communicated in a ubiquitous way that hopefully all stakeholders in a business can understand. People can come onto a project and they understand, what's happening. They don't need to look at the source code to understand what a system does. So in terms of deciding whether AI was a good fit, two core things. Like my goal for UserDoc was the question I was posing was how can a software system do a lot of the work or the heavy lifting that like a product owner, business analyst, solution architect does? Yeah, and that's the two parts there is like a new software system, but also existing software. So digital transformations, rebuilds, understanding legacy systems. These are a lot of the work that goes in there. And I really didn't see a way where AI wasn't powering that engine, really. It's a very nuanced manual process that takes many, many months for people to do manually. So the fit for AI was really kind of there at the start. In terms of the experience designing the platform, I guess from a design point of view, human interaction point of view, as AI and Gen AI is non-deterministic, meaning it's not a Boolean true or false response. It is a fuzzy, ambiguous response sometimes. If anyone's used ChatGPT, which I'm sure most of you have, you can ask it a question 5 times, same question, and you might get 5 different responses back in different ways of communicating. So with that in mind, obviously, we need to ensure that humans are in the loop at all times. It's that the responses back from Gen AI, be it text or video or audio, it's treated as the first draft, and there is the touch points along the narrative where subject matter experts can overlay that human expertise on top of that. So that was one of the things we tried very hard to do. So there's no interaction with AI in the UserDoc platform where the end user doesn't have complete control of both adding context to help it generate more clearer or whatever direction they want to go with the result, or editing over the top of it.
Yep.
Yeah, and design wise, we touched on this. I think Dean mentioned a lot of security and privacy, right? So being very clear throughout the flow of the application that none of your data is used for training. And people are entering quite sensitive data into UserDoc. So this might be, project briefs for where a lot of IP is controlled, or it could be source code to existing systems.
Mm-hmm.
So really showing up front throughout the process that no models are trained using your data. Your data is safe and secure. This was always obviously very standard practices in software engineering, but Gen AI really brought it to a forefront, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah. Before I started working in digital products, just hearing about something like software requirements, documentation, business analysts, I was like, oh, that's incredibly not only techy, but not as important or interesting. But the more I get into software, it is a huge manual effort, even to do the most simple app, like a screen that says enter your name. And if you're describing how it works, because there needs to be a shared language and a shared description of how everything works, not just the product as a whole, but each individual screen. And on that screen, if I enter my name and press a button, what happens? If I
Yeah.
don't enter my name and press the button, what's the error message look like? What happens if the message fails, that sort of thing. So there are so many different pathways to account for. So Gen AI does seem like a really great use of automating that fairly manual task. How did you go about assessing how well it considered all the requirements and designed them? So what was the accuracy building process like for this?
Yeah, so interesting. I think Dean mentioned you guys are looking for an 80% success rate in your project you just demoed. I was the same. I think that's maybe that seems like a safer thing to aim for. Yes, we want it to be 90. We want it to be higher, but 80%.
80 is good. Yeah.
Realistically, yeah, 80 is good. And for me, it was sort of looking at the job, because many software projects, it could be a 6-month requirements elicitation phase for a manual team. So I'm like, if we can reduce 80% of that, that's an amazing direct cost to a business. So 80% was my initial crack. Unfortunately, because software systems are so specific and nuanced, and as you say, one form with one field can have many different edge cases, with the devil being in the detail. If you imagine like complex systems with many pages, many forms, many business rules, and affects when you change this, it affects this screen over here. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to have very clear evaluations and testing frameworks. But the way that we've done it is we've got 3 medium-sized complex software systems that we have painstakingly built the very detailed requirements for in a systematic formula, and have automated the testing. So when we make a change to our prompts, or we're experimenting with a new model, we are testing it against a source of truth that we have manually put together. In an ideal world, and if you have the ability to generate more of that data, or more synthetic data, so that's getting AI to help you build your results you're testing against, then that's amazing. Unfortunately, with a software like UserDoc, where I can have a customer sign up this morning and enter a software system that I've never thought of before. That's very specific to their business, their internal edge cases. It's a bit of the, I hate this as a software engineer where I like dealing in binary true false scenarios, but it's very much the vibe, which kind of sucks. But I look at it as in, with, as Spider-Man's uncle told us, with great power comes great responsibility. The benefits that we get from generative AI are mind blowing. We can do things in 2024 that were absolutely impossible at the end of 2023. So with this in mind, we've got to make sure that we do the best we can for accuracy testing, these sort of things. So yeah, I think that answered your question. I kind of probably got
Yeah,
off track.
totally. And I also I think in the case with the product we built with Dean, there isn't as much you would be able to do with the outputs. You are being given this information, so we want to be really clear about this information being as correct as we can, which is why we weren't
Yeah,
not just using language, but if you looked at the mock-up, it's also just here are your big cards, the options, New South Wales, um, Disability Discrimination Commission, or this one or that one. You all still have, so this is a case of really working to kind of optimize people's organization or their software and be able to look at these results, and maybe I'll tweak a word or two, or every now and then I'll need to make these changes, but it's just huge efficiency gains by having that language drafted for me, which is often the big blocker for people is having to write words on paper. So
100%. It's the mental, especially documentation, right? A big
yeah,
mental barrier involved. And you've done all this work, the documentation's got out of date. It's sort of rotting over there in the corner. Every day it's getting
yeah.
less and less accurate. Yeah, if something can help with that, I kind of knew that, if it's not me, someone else is going to do it, basically.
The old documentation that sits there and you keep saying, when I get some free time, I'll update it, and then you never do. So great to have this available. All right, thanks for that overview. I'm going to pass you over to Akanksha. So can you give us a little bit of background in your work and your interest in AI? I know you've had a very a varied career from a different background than tech. So how'd you get into exploring AI and what interests you about it?
Yeah, so also just gonna start with I'm literally just dying from hay fever today. I've moved into like a very green suburb recently, which is great to look at, but also it's actually killing me, I think.
Mm.
So if I'm sniffly, that's happening. And if I'm crying, it's not AI has not made me cry. It's done it on other days, but not today. But um yeah, look, I did a degree in financial maths and actuarial science. So a lot of that kind of statistics and probability is kind of a background. And I kind of fell into a grad role, which was a data science grad role. And like they're like, you seem to have the text, like the theory stuff. We can teach you the tech, it'll be fine. And it's kind of how that happened. That's essentially how I fell into AI in general. Kind of learning about how the structures behind how these AI platforms work kind of are all founded and work together. So things like data warehousing and how do we actually store the data and what's the format of all these things and how can we actually get insights out of it. So spend a lot of time at the start kind of playing around with all these different parts of data and really kind of kept coming back to that kind of more predictive side of things and what can we actually learn and how do we kind of future implement some of the things that we've learned out of our data. So that's kind of where my experience of AI has kind of started and how I got into it. Um, but in terms of determining if it's fit for purpose, like it depends. Like I'm a consultant at heart. It's always gonna be the start and end all of almost any answer I give it, to be honest. Um, but I guess it kind of breaks down into a few different aspects, and they're very similar to kind of the themes we've already talked about throughout the thing, like whether it was kind of going through that outline of the project that you worked on with the National Justice Project, because you went through all these kind of considerations of the cost and do we understand the problem and what's actually needed. It all really comes back down to it. I guess it's just almost like a simplification of the different key aspects of it, but um, understanding the problem and the amount of times I've been actually, I think it's calmed down a little bit this year in the last couple of months, but up until then, it was very much a we need AI.
Mhm.
And it would go in and ask the question of like, okay, but like for what? That was not the problem. Like that was not even a conversation that was needed to have. They're like, we just need AI. I've got friends in the startup space who literally all they did was tweak their startup deck, like the pitch deck, to include the word AI, and it would bring them into conversations they couldn't get into before.
Mm.
Um, just the mention of the word. So it's really interesting, kind of place to be in as someone who like, hey, this is great for me as a consultant because everyone wants this.
Mm.
But also as an ethical, I'm like, you don't actually need that. That's not really what you're looking for. It's also just there's no need for it. So like really understanding, hey, what's the problem at heart? Why are we trying to solve it? Um, which you guys did a really great job of like explaining the problem, to be honest, at the start of the whole session today. But kind of going from there and then adding in that bit of like the tolerance for imperfection. Like Chris kind of talked about like, hey, we'd love for it to be at 90 or 100, but I'm kind of okay with it at 80 because this is going to have this much of an impact at that kind of answer. So really kind of if 80% is not enough for you, maybe this is not the right solution. Like this might not be the actual choice that you should be making because this is never going to actually make it up to the mark the standards that you've set or are required to set for the solution that you're looking for, and this is never going to hit it. It might down the line and it might be something you can revisit then, but if you already kind of know going into it that's not going to hit the mark, it's not really worth your time spending resources or just kind of that impact of humans and machines and people and cost dollars at the end of it. And then the other big thing, and this is kind of coming back to that experience around data itself, I think almost any single business or team will underestimate the quality of data they have. I don't think
Mhm.
I've ever gone into a single project. Um, I mean, sorry, like don't get me wrong, people are like, I don't know how much we have, but we've got this much, and it's always an underestimation of the quality. So they might be like, yeah, we've got so much data sitting here, it's ready to go. Like an example would be I was come in and do time series analysis. So that's essentially, hey, we've got so much data and we want to see kind of like maybe a cyclical pattern or a monthly pattern in our data. And they're like, we've got so much data, like it's gonna be great. And it's 3 years of data, and they want to do monthly predictions. So when you look at the data, you're like, okay, great, 3 years of data. When you just look at it, like that's a lot of data that you have. But when you're trying to make monthly predictions, you've got 3 data points at the base of it. That's not a lot of data to begin with, then. And it's different facets that you can kind of look at all of these different things at. And it's really important to kind of look at obviously how much you've got, but then the quality of it, like the quality of that data itself also was not great.
Mhm.
And how they stored it and things like that. So there's a lot of different aspects to it. And then I think the last two bits, sorry, I know I'm rambling a bit, but the ethical considerations, which again, we've already talked about a little bit, but what's the data that we're actually getting into the problem? Like, what is the data we're going to be looking? Is there a lot of PII data? Do we need to be storing that? Do we need to even be considering that in the solution that we're building? Do we need to be surfacing this in any context where it might be used in a different format that we inherently didn't obviously predict? Like if you might not see the use cases down the other end of it when you've created a solution, that might the data that you've put into the solution that might get used in an inherently harmful way. The whole aspect of it that comes back to is, do you even need to have that in the first place? And the biggest thing when you're using Gen AI, I kind of want people to remember is like, yes, it's something new, which is amazing. It's all this new thing that it's creating, but it's creating that based on probabilities of things that already exist. Right? It's not me, it doesn't have a brain. It's still a computer at the end of the day. It's not feeling anything. It's just making predictions based on numbers. And it's numbers of what has happened before. And with that inherently will come bias. So you kind of have to be really, really careful when you are creating all these new things or leaving it to run out with things. Um, there is bias that already exists in the world. It will replicate that unless you're making very, very strict guidelines and guardrails around limiting kind of the impact that it'll have. Or, hey, if these are the kind of questions that are getting asked, you need to stop and refer and deflect back to maybe a human that comes into the loop at that stage. Um, but yeah, there's a lot. I could probably keep talking forever. But there, I guess that's kind of like just pulling it in based on what we've kind of already talked about and some of the other aspects. And then the last bit would obviously just be cost. If you've got the people, if you've got the resources that you actually need to be able to build something like that and maintain it. So you can build it, but also you need to kind of factor in the fact that once it's built, it can't just sit alone in the ether and just exist forever. It will break down, it will have issues, predictions can go wrong over time. You need to be able to have kind of liabilities built into, hey, over long term, what's that going to cost aspect going to look like?
Yes, the financial modeling involved with AI, which I'm not very good at in general, thinking about how many people are actually going to click on this button is a bit of an unknown for me, depending on your reach, you know. But then with that, how do the costs scale if I'm making these queries, if just doing test or playing around with it. Like that was a consideration for us. And where do we put this chat button? Because if we put it too much up front, is everyone going to click on it? Is that going to be super expensive? But thankfully, the costs went down substantially over time, in terms of like what people actually are charging now, which is great. Um, there's some questions here that we may get to now as opposed to waiting to the end because they're kind of specific to what you're saying. So when you're thinking about Gen AI, you're thinking about accuracy, which is, like we mentioned, 80% could be enough if it's something that someone can tweak after they get the result and doesn't have any life-changing effects. But if it's super important, I think everyone goes back to the worst use case of AI, which was probably robo-debts, which had massive impacts based off of a prediction with limited data, and wrong outcomes. So in those kind of cases, maybe you don't want something that might not be accurate if you're telling people that they owe you money. Um, Accuracy is important. Also, you mentioned what's being done with the data, PII, so personally identifiable information. How important is data security? We have a question here about, does the sustainability of AI also come into your decisions around whether to implement it or not?
Personally, it does.
Yeah.
Every project I go into and talk to, I definitely bring that up. And I bring it up in the context of a lot of businesses, or when you're talking at that stage of obviously like the conversation that you have with developers or someone in the engineering team will be very different to kind of the people who are making the business decisions. They're not in the nitty-gritty bits of like, hey, how many virtual machines have we got? How many different servers have we got using this? They don't care, right? They don't care about the nuances of those individual pieces. What they care about is like, hey, how much money are we spending at the end of the day? And the conversation with them is to really explain like, it seems cheap as a fundamental idea because that's how it's been kind of marketed and advertised to the general masses of like AI is going to make everything better. It's really, really easy. You can get onto it very quickly and it'll sort your problems. People tend to forget that every single word or letter that you send into it costs money. So that aspect. But then the other end of it is all of those things you send into it to get processed need to be processed somewhere. That means there's a machine sitting somewhere that's running on electricity and it's using some kind of a data center, which is using up resources existing in the world. So I really look at that aspect of it and I try and make sure that's actually really highlighted. When we're looking at the kind of consumption piece. So when I say resourcing, I usually don't actually mean humans in that context. That's labor and workforce. Resources to me are machines that are sitting there to be used, as well as kind of not in front of you in a data center and things that you will never usually physically see, but will be using quite heavily.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to be a bit baffled by the amount of water in particular. So thinking about cooling machines, thinking about using electricity and the very in the world infrastructure involved just to make these little buttons and digits do the thing that you want it to do. So really interesting. Last question I'll take before we move on to the next bit, because it does relate directly to what you just said. So it is interesting when there's piles of data, but the data doesn't actually correspond to the prediction that needs to be made, or provide guidance on how to solve a problem. So you mentioned a scenario where there's only 3 data points to learn from. What do you do in that scenario? Do you try to source more data? Do you let the AI run for a time in a live environment to grow and learn? Is the question here from Monica.
You're gonna love it. It depends, but it depends on the customer. It kind of goes back to the use case. So for them, it wasn't the fact that they only had 3 data points. It was they wanted to build an individual model for each of their customers, which brought it down to 3 points. So overall, if you looked at every customer as a whole together, that was probably enough data to be considered, but that's not what they could do based
Right.
on their own constraints, right? That was their limitations of we can't mix and match different customers' data to be used for each other. Um, so this is where the it depending aspect of most of these answers comes in. But when you do have that situation, quite often, and it's a really, really hard conversation to kind of have with businesses of you're just not AI ready yet. And going back to that starting piece of let's look at what data you're capturing and how you're storing it and what's the kind of processes there. And hey, this will set you back about a year maybe, or whatever aspect of time that it requires to gather that data and build out that kind of data pipeline to create and collect the appropriate data that's required. But overall, in the long run, it's kind of explaining that like long-term picture of if you start this right now, you will be better off in 2 years' time having better data to actually answer the problem that you need. Like I work quite a lot with startups around Australia and Melbourne specifically. And usually the problem is, hey, we've been up and running for the last whatever many years. Data was never a thing we really consider. Like, it's like it's been stored, it's been doing. We've been busy getting this business off the ground. That's not something we've looked at. Can you come in and have a look at what do we even have?
Hmm.
And there's no real right or wrong time. Well, there's always a right time, which is at the start. But if you haven't done at the start of this is the data we should have and these are the problems we're going to have, you can't predict the future. You don't know what the problems you're going to have, and you'll pivot and you'll have different questions you need to answer. So the closer it gets to it, it's like, okay, I think this is the kind of data we need. The right time, the best time is going to be right now if you haven't already started it, whatever many years
Hmm.
of. So it's that kind of a conversation. If we can't find any alternative to whether it's generating other data sources or things like that, that's usually kind of the conversation that needs to get happened.
Yeah, totally. So a couple of things you mentioned there got me thinking about we're talking about the customizing side of making the tech work and do the thing you want it to do. But before that, there's also is my organization AI ready? Is like the what's our data governance strategy currently? There's a lot of around risk management, so there's heaps of stuff for people to consider besides just the technology. All right, so I'm going to go to the last section before we open up to more questions. So the playbook for experimenting with Gen AI. So it's something that we've been reflecting on. Like you mentioned, Ankasha, it was a non-negotiable in terms of having to explore if you, because we also work in the agency space. A lot of time we're coming into organizations and people who are really interested in AI. So you have to learn what it is and what it does because everyone's talking about it. And over time, I think a year ago, we would have been a lot more unsure about what it does well and what it doesn't do well and how to experiment. But we've learned a few things since then. I'm also keen on anyone else from the panels before I share our learnings. What's have you learned about from experimenting with Gen AI over the past year and a half it's been around?
I could jump in and say a lot of things, but I'll focus on some. I'll zoom into a specific part, which may not be obvious to everyone, but that like different models and different versions of models can have a very large impact. So by a model, I mean OpenAI has. You may have heard like the newest one is O1. They have GPT 4.0, GPT 4, GPT 3.5, etc. But OpenAI is just one player in the space. There's also Anthropic, who has the Claude models. There's Google that has the Gemini models and so on. And in UserDoc, especially for importing a large code base and reverse engineering that into documentation, we use all of those providers and different models for specific tasks. So our agents, we have an agentic architecture. Our agents are using different versions of different models because a change that happened 12 a version change on the latest 4.0 about in August had a significantly different impact on one of our prompts. So our input didn't change at all. Nothing, the information we were giving it changed. However, something deep down in the training of that model exposed an adverse effect in the output, which we had no control over, which is both a very hard thing to manage, but as I said at the start, we're dealing with something that's amazing, gives us superhuman powers. So you've got to take these things as caveats that come along with it. So yeah, my thing would be about experimenting with AI. It's not just OpenAI. It's not just GPT-4. There are many little models that can do very hyper specific tasks.
Yeah, and with so the dashboard we were looking at, I don't think we had the one that actually switched models and had results. Not only do different ones have different levels of accuracy in our testing, but different levels of cost. So is there a trade-off there? At the time, for GPT-4 was providing better results. 3.5 was a tenth of the price. What kind of trade-offs do you need to make to be able to get something up and running? What's important to the organization when you're making those decisions? Yeah, and you were about to go off mute as well, Dean.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say in the experience that we had, it was kind of a game of building blocks. You start with a baseline, see how it goes, and then we started slowly adding things. So we started with the fact sheets, saw how the AI responds to that, and then we had a game plan of, building out a prompt that would help fill in the gaps for where the gaps within the fact sheets. And then from there, we considered potentially fine tuning it more. We realized we were lucky enough not to have to fine tune. But yeah, I would say when experimenting, the way to do it safely and efficiently is by just starting with kind of the base level and then moving up from there. And another reason I say that is because now we have a prompt. And as you said, Chris, the model can update at any time and the prompt it might be less effective. But if you change one word in the prompt, it also might have repercussions for the output of the AI. like if we add one rule, it might for the AI contradict another rule. So it's just building it up slowly, but until it's really solid and what you have is solid, is what I learned.
Excellent. Then over to you, Enkancha.
I was actually going to do what Dean just said and say, don't go fast and break things, which is like the classic tech thing to do. I honestly scream that at this stage at a lot of meetups and stuff. I'm like, just don't do it.
Yeah.
Like it stands true. Like the smaller you start, especially, and then it goes back to the resources question as well of like, uh, you can try things out at a really, really small scale very quickly and not spend huge amount of resources and money trying to make it work. But the only other thing I think I would add, which I don't think gets talked about as much either, is diversity. If you've got really diverse teams building your solutions or your Gen AIs, whichever, but also experimenting and like testing them, it goes a really long way in kind of helping with those biases and identifying different factors that might get flagged down the line. I'm
Mhm.
sure see all these things of like things that get put to the market. And you're like, and then gets cancelled for whatever reason. It's like, hey, this is clearly not a great idea. What have you done? And the question kind of that gets asked is like, was there nothing in your whole product line of like ideation to marketing to all this? Did no one flag this as a problem? That's always a question that gets asked whenever these things go to market and things. And quite honestly, I mean, I've asked that question too. I'm like, surely there was somebody. But then the other end of it is I look around and I'm like, oh, I could see that. I could see the reality of there not being enough people to test that. It doesn't have to be your engineering team that does the experimenting and testing and stuff. Put it out to the wider business. I can guarantee there will be enough diverse people in your businesses and teams that can at least have a look and say, hey, that doesn't reflect the reality for me. Can you have a look at that? Like maybe there needs to be another guardrail put into it. Yeah, diverse teams, testing and building.
Absolutely. Diverse teams, we're not at the stage where you can not think very carefully about what you're doing. So that's important for us. We have a couple of takeaways from this report you can find on our website. So experiment a lot. There's a lot more to that. You're experimenting within defined use cases, and you are having those other considerations that we just mentioned there around who's the end user, what's safety and guardrails we need to put in place. But there is an element of play that's really important when it's still internal, and that's one of the fun things about getting onto this early is and having the time and the space to play with it. So I'm very lucky in my role that we get to explore new things and just playing with different models. Like Chris mentioned, there's so many different providers. There's a AI arms race. A lot of them are um, surpassing each other as they go. ChatGPT gained popularity by being the really groundbreaking one in first and often surpassing other models, but Claude and Anthropic have caught up a few times. Llama has its own use cases and purpose, and even within your own day-to-day tasks, just exploring, I'm going to ask this one to lead between different models in terms of the recipes I'm getting. That's the one I like to play with a lot because I struggle with writer's block when I look in my fridge. Focusing on the main use case first and then scalability after. So much like um, human-centered design in general, you really want to think about who is this for? And in that use case, who are we designing for specifically? What's the minimum viable product? What something that meets their needs without all the extra flash around the outsides that we can scale up to later. Data cleaning is really important. Your data is never going to be in a position that you think it is, and often you need to do these exercises like we did with the National Justice Project to find more data, and then just keep prototyping and involve SMEs here means subject matter experts throughout the process is a big important takeaway, which again is not very different to how the human-centered design methodology works in the first place. So that's great. All right, so we'll just finish off with a couple of questions. I think we got 5 more minutes. Great. I have a good one here. I think possibly Ankasha, but happy for anyone to take it. It says, where does AI fit in risk management frameworks now? So pretty open question there, but yeah. Do you have any advice around that? It is pretty risk management frameworks could mean a lot of things, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've got anything off the top of my head. I guess a little if they want to pop in and just kind of define a bit more of what they're looking for specifically in risk management things, unless Chris or Dee, you've got any ideas here.
I Go ahead, Dean.
Sorry, was that I no, it just cut out for a second, so I missed it and I thought maybe it was.
We're just thinking about if where does AI fit into a risk management framework? So I guess for me, if you're looking at the use case and the people involved, so in our line of work in social impacts, justice in particular, which is my as a legal designer, it's my area. You do want to do that thinking up front before you even choose AI. Is this a problem that's fit for AI to tackle? Because what are the risks involved? So another use case would be Amica. So amica.gov.au is a project we've been working on with National Legal Aid for 5 or 6 years now. And it's not generative AI, so it didn't come up in this webinar. It's actually a machine learning model. And what we did with that is really assess the risk of harm in providing a prediction on what a fair asset division between the separating couples would be if they were to go to a lawyer and work this out together or go to court. And we based that off the data set we sourced from lawyers around Australia and then trained in the very traditional data model machine learning way. And that risk assessment process was what's the risk of harm in providing a numerical suggestion? How do we couch this AI portion within other support? So if you think this is wrong, you can negotiate another number. You can call us directly at Amica. So just really thinking through the pipeline of what are the potential harms, which were considered low in this case for an amicable couple who are asking for just a bit of guidance or a starting point for negotiations. But there is still that thinking needing to be done behind creating models like that. Question for Dean. I like that is very clear from the outset what Hear Me Out does. We can point you in the right direction. Do you see yourself expanding your services beyond that, consolidating some of the many companies and streamlining the service? And what about actual legal advice?
Yeah, so we do see ourselves expanding eventually, where we will hopefully integrate with the complaints bodies themselves, also as a standalone, so that people can come to whether it's a CLC, maybe it's integrated into their services or processes, so that eventually you can write down the experience of what happened to you. It'll create the complaint for you, all the
Oh,
relevant legislation from the fact sheets, and it'll shoot it off straight to the complaints body and submit the complaint. The reason why that's kind of the next feature in the pipeline, and why it's important to us, is because, once someone has gone through a traumatic experience, it's one thing to have to write it down once, let alone have to go to the complaints body and say it again. So that was one of the things that we were trying to resolve. People would often go to, say, the New South Wales Ombudsman. They'd explain their situation. They'd be triaged to another complaints body. The other complaints body that have to say the experience again. It was a wrong complaints body that have to go to another one. So by then, people give up on trying to make the complaint. So yeah, the next expansion in the services is streamlining it so that you just have to say it once and it gets sent off. In terms of legal advice, that's a whole different beast, I guess. It's something that really opens us up to legal risk or legal liability, which we don't want to do. There are some other services that are giving it a crack, but yeah, we're not going to venture into legal advice. A reason for that is because, the concept of AI, people often think, oh, I want to make my own lawyer that I don't, it saves me on the salary of a lawyer. But we found that if you just find the niche tasks like triaging complaints or even inquiries, the AI works so much better with those really specific tasks. And so going above that, yeah, unless someone creates their own model completely, I don't see us doing that.
Excellent. Last question. I have 1 minute left, and it's actually one that I that I have. I've never taken the time to look this up, so this is probably for Chris because it's related directly to when you're customizing a Gen AI product and you're doing stuff like retrieval augmented generation. That's one area. What is happening when I'm just using ChatGPT and there's the customized feature in there? You can customize your own experience on ChatGPT. What's the difference between these two things?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. So I think customize on ChatGPT essentially allows you to add information to the system prompt, which is what you're telling the AI its capabilities are. ChatGPT also has like a message history where it can remember some parts about you. It's ultimately very similar. There's very few ways of adding data to, well, actually, there's one way to add data to a pre-trained model, which is provided in the prompt. If you don't want to do fine tuning over the top of that or build your own model, then all of that information gets condensed down into text or possibly imagery or audio and sent in the prompt. So when we're interacting with it in an application, we send like the system prompt, which gives the AI an understanding of its capabilities and what it can do, and then we have the main prompt, which is its questions. But when you're interfacing with it via like ChatGPT, you traditionally just have the main prompt. So if you go into the settings and customize it, that's where you can set like real system level details, which would be, reply in using Australian English, this sort of things that you want to happen across every session, essentially.
Excellent. All right, thanks very much. We are at time. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their lunch period and enduring the attack of pollen and hay fever that causes. I have sinus issues too, so I totally get it. There's going to be a follow-up email that we'll send out with the recording as well. Definitely get in touch and play around with some of the tools or projects that we've been working on and sent, or get in touch with one of our panelists if you're interested in their work as well. So thank you everyone for joining.